that every single frame of the movie required visual effects to be applied to it. In every shot except for two, we had to do what's called Chroma Key, which is to film the kids in front of a green background, and then using software, we make that green background transparent using something called an alpha channel. It's transparent. And then we're able to go ahead and superimpose whatever background we want to put in there in its place. And one thing we found early on is that we didn't have nearly enough green screen to do the job. And so we were doing some very creative filming, and oftentimes we had to do something called masking or rotoscoping, where we would have to sort of paint out things that we didn't want in the shot, but we didn't have enough green screen to get rid of it. And sometimes it was a simple matter of just putting a rectangular mask on the frame to make everything else go away. And other times we had to do frame-by-frame animations on those masks to make all the other things we didn't want in the shot go away. And of course we learned a lot about Chroma Key through this process too, and got much better at it by the end of the process than we were at the beginning. But in addition to that, once we had the new backgrounds in place, there were a lot of things that went into getting the backgrounds that we wanted. The backgrounds you see in the movie are all photographs or actual footage from the region of Israel and Jericho. And they're sort of photoshopped images where any modern structures are painted out, and sometimes we melded different photographs together. And the challenge there was that the lighting on those photographs was different than the lighting we had that we had filmed in the studio, that we like to call it. And so on some of our shots, it's not very convincing. It doesn't really look like they're out in the setting. And then in others, it looks a little more convincing. And it was all just a learning process. I mean, there are some examples. When you see them at the banks of the Jordan River, that is footage of the Jordan River that you're looking at. Anytime you see palm trees, that's footage of an actual palm tree. And if you look closely, you can sort of see the palm leaves are blowing in the wind a little bit. We wanted to just add as much authenticity to the movie as we could with what we had. And so it was going on to the internet to get stock photos and just modifying those to however we needed them for our backgrounds. And then sometimes we would do things with the lighting that made things look a little more authentic. There are several times in the movie where characters are doing things at night, and the lighting that we had there in the studio isn't what you're seeing on the screen. We used software to change the lighting. Or sometimes they're in a candle-lit or a torch-lit room. And so the lighting there is shown in the background and also on the characters, just using some software effects. And one of the most notable scenes that we had that going on was the campfire scene just before the 7th day of marching. They're all sitting around a campfire. Well, of course, the fire wasn't there. The tents weren't there in the background, and the lighting that we filmed in was very similar to this. But using the software, we sort of created that flickery effect that the campfire would have, and the embers rising from the fire and just the different lighting. The giveaway, if you're looking closely, of course, is that the fire would be lighting them from underneath, whereas our lighting doesn't do that. So we sort of cheated that and got away with that, and if you think about it, it's not quite right, but it's good enough. It got us through for what we were doing for the movie. And then I think the other main one was at the final scene of the movie when the wall is falling and the battle is going on. We had it raining, and that's all just software, of course, too, and we just thought it was a nice dramatic touch. And just visual effects to sort of add variety to the film. We wanted the movie to feel alive as much as possible and authentic as much as possible. So we wanted different times of day, different lighting situations. And I think for our first attempt out, I'm pleased with how that turned out.
There are a few scenes in the movie that were not 3D backgrounds, which is pretty easy to tell which ones they are. One being when they were right outside Rahab's house and inside Rahab's house. You will notice that they knock on a wall. You can kind of see the, I believe it was cardboard we painted on, a brick pattern. That was one where we just thought it would be easier to have a small set built in order to make that look more realistic. The other scene where we had to get creative was during the Jordan crossing. We wanted to actually have the priest's feet right there at the edge of the water. That was something that we just had no way of figuring out how to model. So at our church here, we have a sandbox out on the playground that we took and dug a trench through the sandbox, brought out a bunch of plants. I think most of them were fake. I don't remember if we had any real ones, but we did a bunch of plants stuck in the sand all around it. We added some rocks. We carefully molded with our hands and even our feet, moving around to form just a little trench, and then we set up our cameras and areas to make the whole thing look actually bigger than it really was. And then we took a great big huge wheelbarrow full of water and dumped it through there right at their feet so that it would give this impression. And of course, when the water is pulling back and you see it, the actual footage was going forward, and we just reversed it so it would look like the water was pulling back. There were a couple scenes that presented some challenges to us in how we could create them. One was when Salman and Gershon were climbing up the wall. How would we actually make that work? Well, the first shot in that, we actually did the 1960s Batman style, where the green screen is laying on the floor and the rope is actually laying across the floor, and they actually were pretending to climb up the wall while actually doing more of crawling across the floor and pretending like they were pulling themselves. I believe we had somebody holding the rope on one end and they were doing the thing against the floor like this, so it would look like they were climbing up, and then we just took the camera shot and tilted it up so they were climbing up. Then when they got to the top of the wall, how were we going to do that? So we actually took a big long bench, draped the green sheet over the bench, and then they're trying to climb over it, and then we just kind of erased all the green and we put a section of the modeled city of Jericho, the wall, to make it look like they were actually climbing over that section of the wall.
A lot of the visual effects that we did in the movie had many, many layers to them. Anytime you see a crowd scene in the movie, it's important to remember these kids were almost completely filmed one at a time. There were a few limited occasions where we filmed 5, 6, 7 kids at a time on the green screen, but we just didn't have enough green screen to do very much of that. And so when you see kids walking in the backgrounds or you see them standing in a crowd scene, they're filmed one at a time. And those crowd scenes are built layer by layer by layer in the software. And
one of the props we used in the movie, as you see, is the ark that was built to hold the 10 Commandments and several other objects that God had ordered Moses to put in there. How were we going to build that? We had no idea. And one of the ideas that came to, I think, was several years ago for a lesson. We had just built kind of a really simple PVC framework that we had built just to kind of give the kids an idea of the dimensions of it. And we had Tiffany Abink and Arathon Sanders, who did a lot of our props. They took that, I believe it was the exact same frame, and they wrapped it in cardboard and cloth and painted it gold. And actually the purple cover you see going over it is actually a purple bathrobe that they took, wrapped around it carefully, and it's pinned in the back so nothing is showing from the front side. So the back looked way different than the front did, but they did a phenomenal job of that, and many of the other props that were just simple things that were a lot more simple than they actually looked on film.